Hello, I'm Max Halperin, a computer scientist specializing in the application of technology to election administration, particularly the checking in of voters at polling places. It's not a topic that usually attracts a lot of attention, but recently one of the candidates for Minnesota Secretary of State has made it the central point of his campaign. So I thought voters might appreciate some analysis of what Mr. Severson's been talking about. He's talked about several areas, but the one that's attracted the greatest attention he's billed as express lane voting. And the central idea is that if the polling place has computers to check in the voters, and the voters have ID cards, Minnesota driver's license or state ID card that have either a magnetic stripe that can be swiped or a barcode on the back that can be scanned, that they can be checked in more rapidly. And that's an idea that's had a lot of currency, usually called e-poll books. Minnesota law calls it electronic rosters. And he's right, it does speed up check-in. There isn't a great deal of evidence about that, but the best I've seen is a study some researchers at Ball State University in Indiana did. They compared some vote centers that used electronic poll books with conventional precincts that checked people in using paper. And what they found was that the electronic check-in had a typical check-in time of a minute. That's the median. Half were more than a minute, half were less. Whereas the traditional paper-based precincts, the median check-in time was a minute and 15 seconds. So it is somewhat of a speed-up. Mr. Severson's right about that. Question, is that significant? To what extent does that rely on the voter having an ID card? It's the case that you can actually check in even a voter who doesn't have an ID card using an electronic poll book. You type in the first few letters of their name, pick their name out of the list that pops up, or for example the system Minneapolis is using, you would put in the street number and the first few letters of the name. Best estimate I would have, it's a handful of seconds longer than scanning a card. If you've only got a few people in front of you in line, a few seconds here, a few seconds there, it's not going to make a difference. Really the basic problem that I think Mr. Severson seems to be trying to address is where you have really long lines and people are waiting hours, and that has happened. And that doesn't happen because taking in a voter takes a minute 7 seconds instead of a minute or something. That happens because of the number of voters who are in line, and that's a question of not having the adequate resources to process the voters through as quickly as they're arriving. And the queue just keeps getting longer and longer. In the really bad cases, the only thing that ever causes the queue to shrink back down again is that the polling place closes at night and new voters are no longer allowed to join the line. And when that's happened, that's a sign something's badly wrong. Minneapolis, when they experienced that in a few of their precincts in 2012, the city staff did an analysis. They figured out what the problems were that needed to be fixed. They weren't all connected with check-in. I recall a big problem was at the ballot scanning station. Some of the ballots had been misprinted and weren't scanning correctly, and that's where the holdup was. But whatever it is, it's not something you can address by shaving a few seconds off the check-in time. Doesn't mean it's a bad idea to check people in faster if you can. The question is that something new? Well, no, actually, Minnesota law has always allowed the use of electronic poll books. What we did this past legislative session, I say we because I was on the state electronic roster task force, was drafted some legislation that was passed on a bipartisan basis, signed into law, that regulates exactly how local election officials can use electronic poll books, so we don't wind up with some great disaster where all the systems crash and everything's in trouble. And I know Mr. Severson made some comments recently where he called into question that whole process of local election officials having to present their plans for approval to the state. Thought that if the state had just adopted a uniform system of electronic poll books at the state level, then individual counties wouldn't need to be getting plans approved. And I think what he misunderstands is that those plans aren't just about the particular computer system that's being deployed, but about the whole operational situation of how the county is going to deal with contingencies like power failures that might arise. There are only a handful of vendors that are selling electronic poll book systems. If we have 87 counties, we do not need 87 different approvals for the systems, but we do need 87 different approvals for making sure that those counties are responsibly deploying the systems. In any case, that doesn't really get to the heart of what he seems to be talking about with express lane. He's making this distinction. He's not just talking about using electronic poll books. He's not just talking about scanning the cards from the people who have them to check them in faster. He's talking about, he says, setting aside half the lines for people who have the cards and the other half for those who don't. And before we can really get to is that a good idea, bad idea, I think we need to understand really what the idea is. When he says lines, is he literally talking about the line that the voter's waiting in before they can check in, or is he talking about the actual service stations where the election judge is sitting behind the computer checking people in? When you have a whole bunch of different election judges behind different computers checking people in, you don't have one line for each of them. With traditional paper poll books, you have one line for each of them because they're for different parts of the alphabet. But when you have electronic poll books and any election judge can check in any voter, what you do, maybe you've seen it in an airport with checking in for a flight or bank for tellers, is that you have one main line that feeds all of the servers. That just the person at the front of the line goes to the next available server. I think Target has even started doing that with the cash register lines at some of their stores. And there's a reason why all these companies have adopted that system. It's mathematically, provably a more efficient way to serve customers. The basic idea, it's kind of intuitive, you've probably experienced it, if you have to pick a line, like at most grocery stores, you can pick the wrong one. You can wind up regretting it because you're in the slow-moving line, and that exacts a cost in your waiting time. Whereas if there's only one line, then you can't be wrong. So that's the way you would set up a polling place. And so then to say, well, we're going to set half of the lines aside for one purpose or another doesn't make a whole lot of sense if there is only one line. What's half of one? Could he mean half of the election judges are only calling people out of the line if they have the card? He could mean that, or maybe that we have two separate lines rather than one line. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense because most voters do have the cards. If 90% of the voters, he said, maybe 0.01% don't have the cards. I think that's an unrealistically low number from the statistics that have been published, but it would make my point even more true if that were really the case. If you have some small fraction of the voters don't have the cards, there's no point setting aside half the lines, half the servers, one of two lines, whatever it is. You're not really getting anyone out of the way of the voters who have the cards, there's hardly anyone to get out of their way, unless you have a huge, big, long backup, but that's because something's badly wrong in the design of the polling place. I mean, if you don't have adequate resources, the so I don't think there's really anything you can gain by taking some very small fraction of the voters and devoting half the resources to them and the other half the resources to the majority of the voters. So, okay, if that's not what he's talking about, let's look. I don't think the man's unreasonable. I think we should look more closely at what he's said, what he's written, try to understand where it does make sense. And if you do read what's on his website and you do listen to what he says, it starts to sound like he's not really so interested in getting out of the way the voter who doesn't have a card as he is getting out of the way the voter who needs to do election day registration. That those are the ones, and he's right, that really do take substantially longer. I've seen an estimate of maybe 7 minutes instead of 1 minute to process an election day registrant. So if you have one of those in front of you in line, it is a substantial holdup. But that's already been done. If you look at how the local election administrators run any of the reasonably large precincts, any of the precincts with significant numbers of election day registrants, like in a college town. I live in St. Peter, Minnesota. You look at how our precincts run. There is a separate line for the election day registrants already. And there's a separate place where they go, a separate station where they're handled. And that's not just to keep them from backing up the line for the pre-registered voters. It's also concentrating in one place all the special expertise it takes to handle election day registrations. So it's a sensible thing. A good idea doesn't stop being a good idea because it's already been done. Using computer technology to speed up check-in and to speed up election day registration and make it more accurate is a good idea, and it's already being done. Scanning the cards for those who have them is a further boost and is a good idea and is already being done. Separating election day registrants off, having a separate station to handle them with its own line is, again, a good idea and already being done. So all these things I can't fault, although I will say that if someone's centering their campaign around them, you do wonder, are they up to date on what the status of election administration is?